The night air was thick with humidity, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Old River Road, a winding stretch of asphalt cutting through the Texas countryside, was known for being deserted after sundown. The few streetlights along the road flickered weakly, casting long eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. A single car sat at the side of the road, its headlights still on, piercing through the darkness. The engine hummed softly as if still waiting for its driver to return to life. But she never would. Inside the car, Amara Baines sat slumped over the steering wheel, her body motionless. Blood trickled from a wound on the right side of her head, staining her once pristine white blouse. Her dark curls, always neatly styled, were now matted with red. The window beside her was shattered, tiny shards of glass scattered across her lap in the passenger seat. Her phone lay face up on the passenger side, the cracked screen still glowing. A single text message sat unsent, the words frozen in time. "I know what you did, Dad. I'm telling Mom." A message that would never reach its destination. It was 2:36 a.m. when Deputy Ray Moreno received the call from dispatch. Report of a vehicle abandoned on Old River Road. Possible accident, no movement inside. Moreno was used to routine calls, drunk drivers, stranded motorists, the occasional deer collision. He figured it was just another teenager who had run out of gas or fallen asleep at the wheel. But when he pulled up behind the vehicle, something in his gut told him this wasn't normal. He stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting the belt around his waist. His flashlight flickered on, casting a harsh white beam over the scene. The first thing he noticed was the broken window. The second was the girl inside. Moreno moved closer, his boots crunching over shattered glass. He angled his flashlight toward the driver's seat. And then he saw it. The bullet hole. His stomach tightened. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Moreno. I've got an unresponsive female in a vehicle, possible gunshot wound to the head. Request immediate backup and EMS." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy that. Any sign of a weapon?" Moreno scanned the interior. No gun. No sign of forced entry. No stolen belongings. He leaned closer, looking at her face. She was young. Too young. 18 maybe. And something about her looked familiar. Then it hit him. Amara Baines. He had seen her before, at the high school football games, at the grocery store with her mother. Waco wasn't a big city, and the Baines family was well known. Her father, Clifford Baines, was practically a local celebrity in real estate. Moreno took a slow breath. He had questions, but the biggest one was the one every officer feared the most. Who could do this to their own child? By the time Detective Morgan Thatch arrived, the road was already lined with flashing red and blue lights. Yellow crime scene tape flapped in the warm breeze, marking the area as restricted. The medical examiner was already examining Amara's body. The moment Thatch saw her, his jaw clenched. "I assume we're not looking at a robbery," he muttered to Moreno. Moreno shook his head. Nothing was stolen. Purse, phone, keys, all still here. Thatch frowned, stepping closer. He took in the shattered window, the angle of the wound, the way her head had slumped slightly forward. "A professional hit would have left less mess," he murmured. "This looks personal." Moreno hesitated, then handed him the phone in the evidence bag. "She was about to send this?" Thatch read the message. "I know what you did, Dad. I'm telling Mom." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thatch sighed. "Give me Clifford Baines. Now." The Baines home was nestled in a wealthy neighborhood on the outskirts of Waco. A sprawling two-story house, complete with manicured lawns and a wide circular driveway. The kind of house that screamed success, stability, a perfect life. But behind perfect walls, monsters can hide. When the police knocked, Clifford Baines answered the door. His face was pale, his expression carefully blank. He was still dressed in his expensive slacks and button-down shirt, though his sleeves were rolled up as if he had been awake for hours. Marlene Baines stood behind him, her face still puffy from sleep. "What's going on?" she asked, voice thick with confusion. Thatch didn't waste time. "Mr. and Mrs. Baines, we need you to come with us. It's about your daughter." For a fraction of a second, something flashed in Cliff's eyes. Fear. Recognition? But then it was gone. "My daughter?" he asked, voice perfectly measured. "She's been found," Thatch said, carefully watching Cliff's face. "She's dead." Marlene collapsed. Cliff didn't. He did what people expected. Held his wife, whispered reassurances, furrowed his brows in an expression of shock and grief. But Thatch had been doing this job long enough to know when a man was acting. Cliff wasn't grieving. He was calculating. I don't understand," Cliff said. "How did this happen?" Thatch studied him. She was shot. In her car. About an hour ago. Cliff's jaw tightened. Who would do this? That's what we're trying to find out. Thatch paused, then added, we found something interesting on her phone. A text. One she didn't get the chance to send. Cliff's fingers twitched. What text? Thatch pulled out the evidence bag, holding it just long enough for Cliff to see the words on the screen. Cliff went still. Dead still. It lasted only a moment, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear. Guilt. Rage. Then he looked away. I don't know what this means. But Thatch knew better. Cliff Baines was lying. And now he just had to prove it. Waco, Texas, wasn't the kind of city where people locked their doors in broad daylight. It was the kind of place where folks trusted their neighbors, where high school football ruled Friday nights, and where families like the Baines lived in quiet suburban comfort. From the outside, Cliff Baines was a man any father would aspire to be. He owned a successful real estate agency, drove a sleek black Ford F-150, and always made time for Sunday church services with his wife and daughter. He was well-respected, well-groomed, and well-liked. But behind the polished image, Cliff was a man built on lies. To the people of Waco, Cliff was the ideal family man. His wife, Marlene Baines, was a middle school English teacher, a kind woman who always baked extra cookies for school fundraisers and sent thank you notes for even the smallest gestures. His daughter, Amara, was his pride and joy. She had his sharp brown eyes, his determination, and his charming smile, the same smile that had convinced countless homebuyers to sign on the dotted line. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Baines family was picture perfect. But Cliff's perfect world was just an illusion, one that he had spent years crafting. Cliff and Marlene had been married for 20 years. At first it was good. They had been high school sweethearts, young and full of dreams. But as the years passed, the warmth between them faded. Marlene was devoted to her students. Cliff was devoted to his work. At home they became more like roommates than husband and wife. The laughter that once filled their house became polite conversations at the dinner table. Marlene would fall asleep reading and Cliff would stay up late, scrolling through his phone. By the time Amara was in high school, Cliff and Marlene barely touched each other anymore. But Cliff still had needs. And when he looked at his wife, he no longer saw the woman he married. He saw someone who had grown older, someone who no longer made him feel like a man. He didn't cheat, at first. He told himself he wasn't that kind of man. He was just flirting, just talking, just looking. Until he wasn't. Lena had been Amara's best friend since the 7th grade. She had always been at the Baines' house, eating dinner with them, staying over for sleepovers, tagging along on family trips. At first, Lena was just another one of Amara's giggling school friends. But then something changed. Lena grew up. She was 17 the first time Cliff really noticed her. Her long blonde hair wasn't in messy braids anymore, it was straightened, silky, and hanging down her back. The baby fat on her face had disappeared, leaving behind high cheekbones and soft, full lips. She was beautiful, and young. And Cliff liked that. At first, Cliff told himself it was harmless. He gave Lena longer hugs when she came over. His hand would linger on her shoulder when he walked past her. He started making excuses to talk to her alone, asking about school, her plans for the future, her life. Lena noticed. And she liked the attention. When she turned 18, the text started. Innocent at first. Hope you had a good day. Then later, you looked really pretty today. Then one night it happened. Marlene was out of town at a teaching conference and Amara was at a sleepover. Lena had stayed late helping Cliff clean up after dinner. She leaned over the kitchen counter, smiling at him, and he didn't stop himself. He kissed her. She didn't pull away. That was the beginning of the end. The more time Cliff spent with Lena, the more reckless he became. He started sneaking her into hotels under fake names. He bought her expensive gifts, a gold bracelet, a new iPhone, a dress she once said she loved. And in return, Lena gave him something he hadn't felt in years: power, control, youth. But Cliff forgot one thing. Amara wasn't stupid. And she was starting to notice. At first, it was little things. Lena was always texting but would hide her phone when Amara looked. Her father was more protective of Lena than he should have been. And then there was the night Amara overheard them. She had come downstairs late to get a glass of water. Her father was in the living room, whispering into his phone. I can't wait to see you again. Pause. No, baby, she has no idea. Amara froze. She had never heard her father talk to her mother like that. And there was only one person who had been acting strange lately. Lena. The truth hit Amara like a punch to the gut. Her father, the man who had raised her, the man who was supposed to protect her, was sleeping with her best friend. And suddenly everything made sense. Why Lena had been distant. Why her father had been acting strangely. Why there were nights where he came home smelling like perfume that wasn't her mother's. He was a liar. A cheater. A disgusting man. And Amara wasn't going to let him get away with it. Amara didn't wait. The next morning, she walked into the kitchen where her father sat drinking coffee, acting like nothing was wrong. She slammed her phone onto the counter. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice sharp and shaking. Cliff looked up, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "With Lena," Amara said. "I know." For a moment, Cliff didn't react. Then he let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're talking about, kiddo?" "But she did. I saw your text." Amara's voice grew stronger. "I heard you on the phone last night." She saw it then, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Just for a second. But it was enough. Amara leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't tell Mom, I will." Cliff stared at her, his grip tightening around his coffee mug. His perfect life was slipping through his fingers. His career. His marriage. His reputation. And it was all because of her. His own daughter. That was the moment Cliff made his decision. Amara couldn't be allowed to talk. And he knew exactly how to silence her. Amara had always been the kind of person who paid attention to details. It was something her mother used to tease her about. "You notice things most people wouldn't," Marlene would say. "That's why you'd make a great journalist." Amara had considered it, journalism, writing, investigating. But she never thought the biggest mystery she'd have to solve would be happening inside her own home. It started with small things. Things she tried to brush off. First there was Lena. Her best friend, the girl she had known since 4th grade, the one she told everything to. Lately, Lena had been acting weird. She was always distracted, always on her phone. When they used to spend time together, Lena would throw her phone aside, laugh and say, "The world can wait." Not anymore. Now she clung to her phone. She'd smile at random texts and tilt the screen away whenever Amara got too close. Amara had joked about it at first. "Who's the mystery guy?" Lena had laughed too loudly. "No one." Amara didn't believe her. Then came the excuses. Lena had always been the most reliable person in her life. But suddenly she was bailing on plans, canceling at the last minute or not even responding at all. One night they were supposed to have a movie marathon, something they had done since middle school. Amara had gotten the snacks, picked the movies, even made a whole event out of it. But an hour before Lena was supposed to come over, she texted. "Can't make it." "Sorry, I'll explain later." She never explained. Instead, the next day she showed up at school acting perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. Amara didn't press her on it. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Maybe Lena was just busy with something else. But then came the thing that changed everything. It was a Friday night and Lena had slept over. They hadn't done that in a while, and Amara was determined to make it feel like old times. She made popcorn. They stayed up late talking about everything, college, boys, future plans. For a moment, Amara let her guard down. Then Lena's phone buzzed. Lena was in the bathroom brushing her teeth, so when the screen lit up, Amara barely glanced at it. She wasn't trying to snoop. But something about the name on the screen made her stomach drop. Dad. Her dad? Why was her dad texting Lena? It could have been nothing. Maybe it was about something innocent. Maybe Lena had asked him for advice on something. Maybe he was checking in on her. But Amara's gut told her something different. She picked up the phone. The message preview was still there. "Miss you already?" Her fingers went cold. Her head started spinning. She looked at the time. 11:42 p.m. Why was her father texting her best friend at midnight? And why did he say that? She wanted to believe she was misunderstanding something. But deep down she already knew, this wasn't normal. Lena came back into the room, smiling, her hair damp from washing her face. But Amara wasn't smiling anymore. "What the hell is this?" she asked, holding up the phone. Lena froze. For the first time in their entire friendship, Amara saw fear in her best friend's eyes. Lena snatched the phone out of her hands. "Amara? What is that?" Amara asked again, her voice shaking. "Why is my dad texting you that?" Lena backed up, her face pale. I can explain." Amara felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. "Explain? What kind of explanation could there be? Are you serious?" Amara whispered. Lena opened her mouth, but no words came out. That was all the confirmation Amara needed. Amara felt sick. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. How long? When did this start? Why would he do this? And then, the worst question of all. Was Lena in love with him? Amara's entire body shook with rage. "You're disgusting," she spat, her voice filled with betrayal. "You're my best friend." "My dad is?" She cut herself off, unable to even say the words. Lena burst into tears, but Amara didn't feel bad for her. "Not anymore." "How long?" Amara demanded. Lena sobbed into her hands. "A few months. A few months." That meant this had been going on behind her back while she had trusted them. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make the world stop spinning. She grabbed her own phone, hands shaking as she typed out a text. We need to talk." Lena lunged for her, grabbing her wrist. "Amara, please." "No. Don't touch me." Amara's voice broke. "I trusted you." Lena's face crumbled, but Amara didn't care anymore. She walked out of the room and locked herself in the bathroom, heart pounding. She had one more text to send. "I know what you did, Dad. I'm telling Mom." But before she could press send, the door burst open. It wasn't Lena. It was Cliff Baines. And the look in his eyes was something Amara had never seen before. Something dangerous. The night Amara died, Waco was unusually quiet. The wind barely rustled the trees, and the roads were empty except for the occasional passing truck. It was a Thursday, just another weeknight for most people. But for Amara Baines, it was the night her life would end. She wasn't supposed to be alone. She had spent the entire day on edge, replaying the last 48 hours in her mind. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching her own life unravel in slow motion. Lena had refused to talk to her, brushing off every attempt Amara made to meet in person. "You're overreacting," Lena had said over the phone earlier that morning. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Amara did know. And she had proof. She had seen the text messages. She had overheard the phone call her father made late at night. And worst of all, she had seen the way Lena looked at him, the kind of look a best friend should never give to your father. She tried to eat dinner that evening, sitting at the table across from her mother, but every bite tasted like ashes. Her father acted normal, making casual conversation, pretending like their world wasn't about to fall apart. But Amara wasn't pretending. She had made her choice. She was going to tell her mother. She had written out the text, thumb hovering over the send button. But something inside her hesitated. Was this the right way to do it? Could she just send something this big over text? Instead, she deleted the message and decided to confront her father one last time. At 9:47 p.m., Cliff texted her. "Meet me by the old gas station on River Road. We need to talk. Just us." Amara's hands shook as she stared at the message. She knew this was it, the conversation that would change everything. Maybe he was finally ready to confess. Maybe he was ready to admit his mistakes, to beg for forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, she could convince him to tell the truth before she had to do it herself. She grabbed her car keys, told her mother she was going out for a drive, and left without another word. The gas station he mentioned had been abandoned for years. The sign hung crooked, half of its neon letters missing. The old fuel pumps were covered in rust, their hoses cracked and useless. It was the kind of place no one had a reason to visit anymore. And that made it the perfect place for Cliff to do what he planned to do. Amara arrived first. She pulled into the empty lot, turned off the engine and took a deep breath. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at her phone. 9:58 p.m. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, at 10:15 p.m., she saw the familiar headlights of her father's truck pulling in. Cliff parked beside her and stepped out. He looked normal. No signs of panic. No anger. Just the same calm, controlled expression he always wore. Amara rolled down her window. "I don't want to fight," she said before he could speak. "I just want the truth." Cliff sighed and leaned against her car, rubbing his face like he was exhausted. "Amara, honey, you're making a mistake." She scoffed. "A mistake? You think I'm the one making a mistake?" Cliff's tone stayed soft, patient, like he was speaking to a child. "You don't understand, sweetheart. You think you know everything but you don't." Amara clenched her fists. "I know enough." She pulled out her phone, unlocking the messages she had saved. The texts between Lena and her father. "Thing I love yous, the plans to meet in secret. The proof." She held it up for him to see. Cliff stiffened. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening just slightly. It was the first real crack in his calm facade. "You ruined everything," she whispered. "You're supposed to be my dad." Cliff swallowed. He wasn't angry, not yet. Instead he looked sad, almost regretful. "I never wanted to hurt you, Amara," he said softly. "You have to believe me." But Amara had stopped believing in him a long time ago. Amara shook her head. "It's too late for that." She turned the phone toward her, scrolling to her mother's contact. I'm done protecting you. I'm telling Mom. She never finished her sentence. Because that was the moment Cliff pulled out the gun. It was small, barely bigger than his palm. A .22 pistol. Easy to conceal, easy to fire. Amara's eyes widened. Dad? It happened so fast she didn't even have time to scream. Cliff raised the gun, pressed it against her temple and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, loud in the quiet emptiness of the gas station lot. Then silence. Amara didn't move. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the car floor with a dull thud. The screen was still on. The text message was still open. But Amara would never send it. Cliff stood there for a moment, staring at what he had done. His daughter, his only child, was slumped against the window, her lifeless eyes still half open. Blood trickled down the side of her face, soaking into her dark curls. The metallic scent filled the car. Cliff let out a shaky breath. It was done. It had to be done. He reached inside the car, grabbed her phone, and wiped it clean with his sleeve before tossing it onto the passenger seat. Then he stepped back, heart pounding. His ears were ringing. His hands were steady. He thought he would feel something, guilt, regret, grief, but there was nothing. Just the cold understanding that he had done what was necessary. Amara was gone. And now, all he had to do was make it look like someone else had done it. Cliff acted fast. He moved her body just slightly, positioning her like she had been ambushed from outside the car. He shattered the driver's side window with the butt of the gun, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. Then he took the gun, wrapped it in a cloth and shoved it inside his jacket. One last look at his daughter. Then he turned, got into his truck and drove away. As he disappeared into the darkness, the only sounds left in the night were the hum of Amara's still-running car engine and the distant howls of coyotes in the Texas wilderness. Detective Morgan Thatch had spent over 20 years in law enforcement, but nothing about this case sat right with him. The moment he saw the crime scene photos, the shattered driver's window, the clean single shot to the head, the untouched purse on the passenger seat, he knew this wasn't random. This wasn't some reckless carjacking, some robbery gone wrong. This was personal. Morgan had seen enough homicides to know when a victim had been killed by someone they knew. And Amara Baines? She hadn't died at the hands of a stranger. Someone had waited for her, aimed carefully, and made sure she was dead before leaving the scene without a trace. That wasn't the work of an amateur. That was the work of someone desperate. When officers first interviewed Amara's parents, Cliff and Marlene Baines, it was clear who was grieving and who wasn't. Marlene was shattered. Her hands shook as she held a tissue to her face, her voice barely above a whisper. She was my baby, she kept saying. My only child. Who would do this to her? Cliff, on the other hand, had a very different reaction. Unlike most fathers who lose their daughters to brutal murders, Cliff didn't look angry. He didn't look like he wanted justice. He looked worried. At first, Morgan chalked it up to shock. Not everyone reacts the same way to grief. Some people shut down, some lash out, and some, like Cliff, try too hard to seem normal. But there was something off. Cliff was too prepared. Too composed. He never asked the typical questions, never once said, "Who did this?" or "To find them." Instead he said things like, "Amara had been hanging around the wrong people lately. I always worried about her driving alone at night. I just hope this wasn't some random psycho." The way he spoke, it was as if he were planting ideas in their heads. Trying to steer them toward some other suspect. Anyone that wasn't him. And that's when Morgan's gut told him. Cliff Baines was hiding something. The first real break in the case came from a security camera at a gas station on the outskirts of Waco. Officers were checking footage to see if Amara had been followed. Instead, they found Cliff Baines' truck, a distinct silver Ford F-150, driving down Old River Road at 11:42 p.m. Amara was killed at 11:45 p.m. When Morgan saw the footage, he felt his stomach turn. Cliff had told them he was home all night. He had looked them in the eye and lied. And for what? To protect himself. Or, maybe, to protect someone else. After the gas station footage, Morgan and his team subpoenaed phone records from Amara, Cliff, and anyone else connected to the case. The results? More lies. Cliff's phone pinged off a cell tower near Old River Road at 11:44 p.m., 1 minute before Amara was shot. He had called Lena Fairchild just 5 minutes before that. And Lena? She had called him back right after the murder. Something wasn't adding up. Lena Fairchild sat across from Morgan in the Waco Police Department interview room, her hands twisted in her lap. She was only 18, but the way she carried herself, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, told Morgan she had a lot to hide. He slid a photo of Amara across the table. "You were her best friend," he said. "You loved her, right?" Lena flinched. Her lower lip trembled. I did. Morgan leaned forward. Then tell me, Lena. Why were you on the phone with Cliff Baines minutes before Amara was murdered? Lena's breath hitched. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her jeans. I don't know. You don't know? Morgan repeated. Or you don't want to say? Silence. Then Lena cracked. She burst into tears. She told them everything. Lena admitted that she and Cliff had been involved for over a year. It had started small, flirting, text messages, lingering touches whenever Amara wasn't looking. By the time Lena turned 17, it had turned physical. I thought he loved me, Lena sobbed. I thought we were, I don't know, something real. But then she told them something even worse. Amara found out. She confronted him, Lena whispered. She told him she was going to tell Marlene. She told him he was disgusting. That was the motive. Cliff Baines killed his own daughter to silence her. Morgan knew they needed one more thing, the murder weapon. And as it turned out, Cliff wasn't as smart as he thought. A search warrant for Cliff's house uncovered a hidden safe in his garage. Inside, a 9mm pistol. Ballistics confirmed it was the exact gun used to kill Amara. Game over. When officers arrived at Cliff's house, he was sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't demand to know what evidence they had. He just sighed. Like a man who knew it was over. As they cuffed him, he didn't fight. He just whispered one thing. She was going to ruin everything. And just like that, the truth was out. The case exploded across Texas. Local newspapers called it a father's ultimate betrayal. True crime podcasts picked up the story within weeks. National news outlets ran headlines like, "Own Texas man kills own daughter to hide affair with her best friend. Oh, the dark secret behind Amara Baines' murder." Even those who had known Cliff for years, his real estate clients, his old high school friends, couldn't believe it. Marlene never spoke to Cliff again. She packed up their house, left Waco, and moved back to her sister's home in Dallas. She was my whole world, she told reporters once. I married a monster and I didn't even know it. When asked if she had ever suspected Cliff of being unfaithful, she only shook her head. I thought he loved me. I thought he loved us. But Cliff had never been a loving father. He had been a selfish man who thought his own desires mattered more than his daughter's life. And now he would die behind bars. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet hum of the ceiling fans above. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. The people of Waco, Texas had been following the trial for months, and now at last the verdict was here. In the front row sat Marlene Baines, a mother whose grief had aged her overnight. The once lively school teacher now carried herself like a woman who had lost everything, because in many ways she had. Her daughter, Amara, was gone. And the man she had spent over 2 decades building a life with had become something unrecognizable, a monster. Beside her sat Amara's aunt, Vivian Parker, her hands clutching a folded tissue that she hadn't used. She just held it, squeezing it between her fingers as if the pressure would keep her from breaking apart. The judge, Honorable Samuel Ridley, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before addressing the courtroom. His voice was steady, but the weight of what he was about to say could be felt in every corner of the room. Mr. Clifford Baines, this court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and arguments presented over the past several months. The loss of Amara Baines is a tragedy beyond words. A young woman, full of life and promise, taken from this world by the very man who was supposed to protect her. Cliff sat at the defendant's table, his posture eerily calm. He was wearing a navy blue suit, one that now hung loosely on him after months in county jail. His hands were folded in his lap, and his expression was unreadable. He did not look at Marlene. He did not look at anyone. The jury had been out for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. The speed of their decision was a testament to the evidence against him. Surveillance footage, phone records, Lena Fairchild's tearful testimony. It had all pointed to one undeniable truth. Cliff had murdered his own daughter in cold blood. And now it was time for the sentence. The state of Texas does not take murder lightly, the judge continued. This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder. Given the premeditated nature of your actions, the betrayal of trust, and the overwhelming evidence against you, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst from Cliff. No desperate plea. No last-minute confession or apology. Just silence. Marlene closed her eyes. She had prepared for this moment for months, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of hearing it. Her husband, the man she once trusted with her life, was now a convicted murderer. Tears slid down her cheeks. But she did not weep for Cliff. She wept for Amara. She wept for the life her daughter would never have. The milestones she would never see. The family holidays that would forever have an empty chair. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters, community members, former friends of the Baines family. Some held signs with Amara's name on them. Others just watched in silence, processing the weight of what had just happened. Waco had never seen a case like this before. A father murdering his daughter to protect his own selfish desires. The betrayal was too deep, too unfathomable. Local news stations had covered every moment of the trial, and now their cameras pointed at the doors of the courthouse, waiting for the moment Cliff would be taken away for the last time. When he finally emerged, his hands were cuffed, his face still blank, his once proud shoulders now slumped. A reporter, Jasmine Rowe from Channel 5 News, shouted over the crowd. "Cliff, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Cliff didn't answer. He just walked forward, escorted by 2 officers, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. And then, out of nowhere, a voice rang out from the crowd. "You don't even look sorry?" It was Lena Fairchild. She had been standing among the spectators, unnoticed until now. Her eyes were red, her face pale. The girl who had once loved Cliff in secret now looked at him with nothing but disgust. "You ruined everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Cliff didn't even turn his head. He just kept walking. That night, Marlene returned to a house that no longer felt like a home. The walls were still lined with pictures, family vacations, school events, holidays. But they felt like relics of a life that no longer existed. She walked into Amara's bedroom and sat on the bed, running her hands over the soft pink comforter. Amara's scent was still there, faint but present. She picked up a photo frame from the nightstand. It was a picture of her, Amara, and Cliff, taken 3 years ago at a 4th of July picnic. They were all smiling. Marlene wanted to smash it, but she didn't. Instead, she just held it close and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby." Because no matter what the courts had ruled, no matter what sentence was given, justice could never bring her daughter back. And that was the real punishment Cliff would face. Not just the bars of his prison cell. Not just the whispers of other inmates who now knew who he was. But the fact that he would wake up every day knowing he had destroyed his own child's life. That, in the end, was a fate worse than death.